It's an amazing irony, actually, given that she is this incredibly Europhilic politician. She has written extensively about how she has no regrets, about how she sort of conducted Germany's policy in that period around 2015 with the migrant crisis. And yet it does seem to have sort of sown the seeds for the situation that Europe now finds itself in.
Hello and welcome to Spectator TV. This week, the cover is on Borderlands, and the person that wrote that cover piece is Lisa Haseldine, one of our writers, where she looks at how in Europe the borders have completely changed and potentially since Angela Merkel's 16-year reign as Chancellor. Now, joining Lisa and I is also Constantin Eckner, who is a journalist, a freelance journalist, but regularly writes fantastic pieces for The Spectator. So welcome, both of you.
Thank you for having me.
Lisa, I wanted to ask you a little bit. Obviously, the design has several different current European leaders, but I wanted to ask you about how this piece came about and how it evolved over this past week when you've been writing it.
Yeah, of course. So the idea of Europe sort of bringing in these temporary border controls is something that I've been aware of for a little while, so particularly through my coverage of Germany and the migrant crisis. So Germany brought in these border controls for the first time in October 2023. So that had been sort of in the back of my mind for a little while, but I was actually on holiday earlier this month in Italy where the idea for this piece really began to come together, because on the way home, or rather when we were setting out to go home, I had Googled the website for the airport in Italy where we were, and this pop-up notification came up on the airport's website bit saying, attention travellers, as well as non-EU travellers, all EU travellers travelling to migration-sensitive countries, in quotation marks, such as Germany, France or Sweden, will be asked for a few additional checks at the point of boarding the airplane.
Wow.
Which really sort of piqued my interest, because I thought, really quite striking for, obviously it's just an airport and it'll be somebody working for the airport who'll have written that notice, but to have described these countries as migration sensitive. So that kind of gave me the kernel for looking into really what was going on a Europe-wide level with regard to free movement and how the migration crisis ties into it.
And in your piece, you sort of begin with the idea that Angela Merkel, who started the idea of open borders, started the beginning of the end of migration controls.
Yeah, it's an amazing irony, actually, given that she is this incredibly Europhilic politician. She has written extensively about how she has no regrets, about how she sort of conducted Germany's policy in that period around 2015 with the migrant crisis. And yet it does seem to have sort of sown the seeds for the situation that Europe now finds itself in. The fact that these countries across the European Union are resorting to essentially curtailing freedom of movement to try and tackle the pressures that they are under with regard to regular migration, I think is fascinating. And yet it all just really comes down to summer of 2015 and how Angela Merkel really sort of kicked things off.
And Constantin, what did you make of Lisa's piece, and how much, as a European, you live in Germany and you are German, how much has this concept of free movement changed over the past couple of decades for you?
Yeah, I mean, growing up because of the Schengen Treaty and everything involved in the European Union, free movement was one of the pillars of the European Union. When we were talking about the European Union, I mean, that was one of the main points and positive points, of course, concerning the Union. But nowadays, I mean, of course, if you cross a border and you're waiting in line on the Autobahn or wherever, it's a bit of a headache. I mean, for the transportation of individuals, it's more or less only a headache, but also for the movement of goods, it becomes even has an economic impact, actually. But nowadays we less and less talk about free movement as being one of the positives of the European Union, because we have dialed down on freedom of movement. And so I guess, in a sense, the European Union has lost at least one of its pillars to an extent.
And for you, how much has Angela Merkel's legacy changed since she left government?
Well, it's interesting. Since she left government, it has been fairly quiet, and she hasn't really addressed the public that often. Which is interesting because sometimes you have these former heads of state who are then really active in the public eye, writing books, writing newspaper columns, or what you name it. But as far as Angela Merkel is concerned, I mean, sometimes you hear from her, but she's almost being a ghost at some point. More recently, she sometimes interfered when it came to the CDU and the leadership debate and Friedrich Merz's quest for chancellorship. But overall, you don't really think about Merkel that much anymore, to be honest. It's really interesting, especially compared to someone like Helmut Schmidt, who was the chancellor in the 1970s and 1980s. After he left, he was still one of the more prevalent public figures in Germany for decades, basically. Merkel has chosen a bit of a different path.
Lisa, in your piece, I think it was interesting some of the different ways different European countries have moved to control their borders. So, Meloni's had her own way of doing things. What are some of the different tactics that they're using?
Yeah, so as you mentioned, Meloni, she's probably the European leader, I suppose, who's got furthest or been most proactive about trying to not only, I suppose, sort of ease some of the pressures on Italy to do with irregular migration, but actually, I suppose, to kind of go that step further and talk about how to deal with the asylum process itself once these people have arrived. So her idea has been to kind of in a way copy what Britain was doing with the Rwanda scheme, except with Albania. So she has struck a deal whereby asylum seekers coming to Italy would then be sort of transferred to Albania, where their asylum claims would be processed. So that's one way that European leaders are dealing with it. This plan of hers has sort of hit a few stumbling blocks. The European Court of Justice has sort of found issue with some of the ways that the scheme is working, so it hasn't actually come into operation yet, but sort of, I suppose, watch this space. Then there are others such as, Friedrich Merz in Germany, the way that he's dealt with it. Some of it, I think, has been a little performative because it's also trying to show to voters that they are doing something, particularly given that the far-right party, the Alternative für Deutschland, the AfD party, has really been able to capitalise on the sort of fervour in Germany around the migration question. So what he has done is essentially, since coming into power in May, tightened up border controls, giving federal police new powers to turn away people at the border, and also to basically give border guards more powers to sort of check people's documentation when they're entering the country, and basically trying to push the people that are trying to enter the country back towards Poland. This has also had a very interesting sort of repercussion in so much that then the Polish government has introduced their own reciprocal temporary border checks. So Poland was, I think, the most recent country now to have introduced these temporary border controls. And they've essentially said, no, we don't want Germany pushing all these people back onto ours, like, please deal with them. And it's created a bit of diplomatic tension there as well.
Mm. And Constantin, when you look back at Angela Merkel's policy, what was it, Lisa?
Wir schaffen das, the Willkommenskultur.
Welcome everyone. And it was off the back of the Syrian war. And I'm interested to know what was it in Angela Merkel's psyche and perhaps the German psyche that meant they wanted to have totally open borders for asylum seekers to come into Europe. Is it too much of a stretch to suggest that perhaps it was something to do with the nature of the coverage of the Syrian war? It was one of the first wars where people could document the whole thing on mobile phones and stream them onto social media. Or maybe this could be another stretch, but is it something to do with the hangover of Germany from the war and wanting to do right by people? It was such an unusually large policy to take on. What do you think what it was about Angela Merkel that made her want to make such a statement?
Yeah, I think you addressed an interesting point that there's still the rescuer syndrome, in a sense, when it comes to Germany and German foreign policy, and also just policy in regards to foreigners. Because of the history of Germany, there's always put a very strong emphasis on human rights and a welcome culture, and basically striking out anything that could be perceived as racist or xenophobic and so on and so on. So, I mean, that's one point, of course. And I think Merkel wanted to portray herself, but also her government, as one that welcomes people and is open and is really putting an emphasis on human rights. On the other hand, I also think there was a few years after the financial crisis, and Germany was going through the financial crisis and survived the financial crisis very well, actually, was economically strong around 2014, 2015. So there was also the feeling of almost invincibility. So like we can do anything. Our economy survived the financial crisis while others are suffering, at least economically. Germany isn't suffering at all. We are as strong as ever. And of course, what people know is that usually you are not always strong economically. It's always going up and down, which we know today as we are now more or less in a recession. And so, but at that point, was like basically like a box on steroids a little bit. You were feeling like invulnerable, and Germany and the German government felt like that a little bit. So that's why some in Berlin thought taking in maybe 1 million foreigners, not a big of a deal. We have enough space, we have enough economic power, which of course, in hindsight, was probably not the right thing to do.
And what were some of the key moments that led to the shift in perspective? Is it squeezing of public services? Is it some of the terrorist attacks that were carried out?
Not so much singular events. It was just when then the numbers were rising and some cities were taking in more and more asylum seekers, because, of course, some of these asylum seeker shelters basically were built up in particular cities, and then you got like my hometown, 60,000 people live there, but all of a sudden you have maybe 1,000 or more Syrians and other people from the Middle East there as well, and they are of course visible, and then people got more and more upset about it. And now 10 years after that, ZDF, so one of the public broadcasters, released a documentary about 10 years wir schaffen das, we can make it. And some of these cities now have foreigner percentages at 35% or so in smaller cities, where of course the entire identity basically and DNA of these cities has changed. And so the local politicians, but also state politicians, got confronted by their voters and their voter base. And that's basically that people were saying, it's not my city anymore. It's feeling completely different. There are corners in my city where people only speak Arabic. And especially in these smaller cities and medium-sized cities where people might not be as cosmopolitan in a sense as they are in Berlin or Munich or Frankfurt, of course, that's very concerning to them. And I think politics also never made a real attempt to address these concerns in any way. It was like deal with it basically for a few years. And it was also a big mistake. I mean, if you are allowing for hundreds of thousands to come in, you have to address the situation also on the ground, especially when you build up asylum seeker shelters somewhere in rural areas or in smaller cities, and you don't do anything, you just build them up and let it be, and that's not the right thing to do. And of course, then politicians got in hot water, especially here on the local and state level.
And of course, Lisa, Britain had its own story because Britain voted to leave the EU. The main reason behind that was to take back control of its borders. And in your piece, you mentioned that, ironically, the reverse has happened.
Yes. So where in the European Union for the first sort of 7 months of this year so far, it seems that the number of irregular migrants entering sort of through various channels into the European Union is dropping. We're very much seeing the reverse happening for the UK. So according to Frontex, which is the European Union sort of border patrol organisation, there have been nearly 42,000 exits from sort of the northern edge of France and Belgium into the Channel to get to Britain, which is a vast jump on sort of what has happened last year. There is a discrepancy between how many people Frontex records and how many people the Home Office records as having actually landed in the UK. So that discrepancy, we think, is basically down to failed attempts to cross. But essentially what we're saying is that, yes, where the European Union's measures seem to be working and preventing people from being able to enter the EU, we are seeing the reverse, and that more people are basically making it over towards Britain.
Wow. Lisa and Constantin, thank you for joining us on Spectator TV. And if you would like to read Lisa's piece on Borderlands in full, you can pick up a copy of the magazine or head to spectator.co.uk/subscribe.